Welcome to the first episode of Meet Me at the Wall. I'm Doug Markinet, one of your hosts, along with my dear friend and neighbor Ann Goodwin and my new friend Betsy Schmeeken, both of whom you'll meet here in a moment. This podcast came about after years of research and curiosity from Ann and Betsy, and is essentially what we like to call bringing ancestry to life. We hope you enjoy listening and perhaps are inspired to delve a little more into your own family story. Thank you. Welcome to Meet Me at the Wall. A podcast exploring author Ann Goodwin's time-traveling journey after discovering hundreds of letters written to her grandmother over a century ago. We visit the space where fact meets fiction, truth fosters imagination, and delve into the past while keeping an eye on how lessons from history affect us today and even tomorrow. All right. Well, thank you for joining us here on the very first episode, Season 1, Episode 1 of Meet Me at the Wall. I'm here with Ann Goodwin. Hi, Ann.
Hey, Doug.
And Betsy, I don't even know your last name yet.
Schmeeken.
Betsy Schmeeken is here to my left. We're all here together to talk about something very special that Ann started during COVID, although it started much before that. Ann, do you want to tell us a little bit of background about how you got into this venture?
Sure. And you're right. It did start much before the COVID years. I was enthralled by an armoire in my grandparents' house. They lived in this house for 60 plus years. The third floor was an armoire that was stuffed full of letters. And when I was a young girl, I used to like to go and explore those letters. And I came across one letter that was written as a condolence letter. My grandparents unfortunately lost a son at 19. And I read a letter that a woman wrote to my grandmother that actually made me almost feel good about Dick's passing. It was so beautifully written. So fast forward years later, my mother and I were going through my grandparents' house to organize their goods for us to disperse them. And I knew that my mother was in a toss mode, and she would have thrown all the letters away that were in that armoire. So I went up and I grabbed a trash bag and a box, piled hundreds of letters into that bag and box, and shipped it off to myself in Atlanta, where I lived at the time. 35 years later, when we were staying safer at home, I decided that I needed to check out our bedroom because I thought we were both going to die. And I thought that it would be helpful to make sure I didn't have any incriminating evidence that I wouldn't want anyone to see. And I got to my closet and I looked up and saw a box. I thought, what is in that box? Pulled it down. And it was the box I'd shipped myself 35 years ago.
Wow.
And opened it up, and it was all these letters written to my grandmother that started in the late 1800s and moved all the way through the 1960s.
So how many letters are we talking about here?
Hundreds.
Hundreds of letters. So how big was this box?
Not that big.
Oh, but
it was a mover's box.
It was a mover's box.
It was a regular mover's box, and they condensed and stayed perfectly kept in a plastic bag in a cardboard box for some reason. It was the perfect humidor or something that protected them.
So I actually hadn't realized that you had sort of saved these letters from what would have certainly been being tossed.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. And I hadn't realized it either until I saw the box.
Until you saw the box. You forgot about them. Yeah. Other things happened. There's a lot. Yeah.
And then that ended up being the best gift because what I had then was something to do. Which meant I read every one of those letters during COVID and took copious notes as I went along. And in that, I experienced with my grandmother the Spanish flu pandemic, World War I. I watched the 20s start to roar, the Depression, World War II, letters from people overseas in World War I and World War II onto the 50s. So that was the journey I started on with my grandmother and have literally been on it ever since. And it's now been almost 4 years.
I know you like to call it time traveling with flow.
It is.
Right?
It is definitely time traveling.
Interesting. So Florence June Westgate. How well did you know your grandmother before she had passed away? How old were you when she passed away?
I was in my 30s when she passed away, and I knew my grandmother well. My grandparents were very active in our lives. We didn't live near them, but we had Sunday evening phone calls. All 5 of us kids talked to our grandparents and told them about our weeks and stuff. And my grandmother was a very interesting character.
What was the family lore back then about your grandparents? Was there anything that kind of you would have expected to find in the letters, maybe you didn't, but that you know about your grandmother?
I know that she was a woman with a great sense of humor. She had a wonderful wit. She also, as I mentioned, her son died at 19, so there was a dark side to her that kind of came out barbed every once in a while. So she was a complicated person, I would say. My grandparents loved life. They loved travel. They loved their friends. They were very generous people. They took care of a lot of people. And they lived just an interesting existence.
So, Anne, I've known you for some time now, and you're a wonderful author. You write a lot of memoir writings and multiple books about people you've met and things that you've personally experienced. What inspired you to write what I'm going to call historical fiction now about your grandmother? Obviously, the letters is a part of it, but what really sparked you to start writing about it versus just studying these letters?
I think it was a survival tactic for me because I had absorbed so many characters and so many events and so many details after, at that point, it was 2.5 years of intaking these lives. And I got to the point where if I didn't release that information, I was probably going to implode. So, and then I still don't know what I'm writing. I don't know what the final outcome of this project is. But what I did know was that I was compelled at some point to start sharing what I was absorbing. And the way it came to me through these letters is that I have details, nuggets of things that I know happened for sure. And so what I did, as you know, we've met on a lake, so swimming is important to me. And I just started one day, I jumped off the pier and started to swim and thought, well, what do you know happened, Anne? Well, I know my grandmother was engaged to 2 people at the same time. Oh, well, what did it look like when? And I would just imagine a scene. So I would swim, imagine, swim back, try not to talk to anybody between the pier and my studio so I could actually remember what I came up with, and just started hearing these voices and characters and seeing these scenes. And that is what has compelled me to write fiction, if that's what I'm doing, because I really don't know what the end result is.
I like to think of it as historical fiction because you've woven in so many beautiful historical points of view that I never understood about this era that we're talking about. So
yeah, and that's been part of the fun part of the journey. And there was a letter from my grandmother's bestie, Shiny was her name, and she was writing about a murder trial, and she used the word phlegm, New Jersey, and she talked about setting up a lemonade stand to endow Sweetbriar with the money from the murder trial. I thought, what is this? It was 1939, and I thought, Phlegm, New Jersey. Well, it was Flemington, New Jersey. And it actually was the murder trial of the baby who was kidnapped, Charles Lindbergh's.
Lindbergh, wow.
The Lindbergh trial.
Yeah.
So it was, I'm seeing history happen in real time.
Yes.
And then I use my imagination and build around it.
I love it. All right. So Betsy, sitting here to my left. Betsy, how did you get into the flow here?
Well, the starting point I remember is Anne inviting me over to take a look at these letters because I was so intrigued by this thing that she was involved in. And so I visited one day and we went up to your room and you pulled out all of these letters. And, you know, some of them were tied with ribbon and some of them were in plastic bags. And it just seemed like a great world to be involved in during COVID. What a departure from what we were all experiencing. And for me then, becoming involved, it was like I could jump into another world and have this whole other interesting observation of life.
And we literally were standing with all these letters on my bed and decided, oh, okay, so if this is a project and you're in, we're going to need an office.
Yes.
Sure.
And
some space.
And that was an interesting project because we live in Beloit, Wisconsin, and I live part-time in Madison, Wisconsin. And we were looking for offices in Beloit, and I looked in offices in downtown Madison. Our apartment in Madison is in a 1920s building, and it occurred to me it'd be very handy to have an office commute that would literally just be floors away from where I was living.
Sure.
So we found a space available in our building, and it was like home to the letters. It's a 1920s building, and they fit perfectly. And I think could be why they're so, we say active. The letters are very active in our process because they are in the right spot. And so it's fun. Betsy comes and we spend the night, and we'll spend 2 full days just absorbed in another time.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been in the office. It is truly a fitting location to house this collection. And in our show notes, we're going to have a couple photos of what the office looks like and what some of these wonderful letters bundled together and things like that. So check that out if you're interested.
It's been described as a crime scene detective mystery story because we have 18 by 24 posters all over with different colored inks and different people. So we look like we're solving some great crime.
It does. You're right.
And all we're doing is just letting the letters lead, and we're just collecting information.
Wow. Just to preview what you'll find during this and upcoming episodes is you're going to see all the threads that get sewn together here to really have a beautiful tapestry of the life of Florence Westgate and her friends and the discovery of all of this. So I think what we're going to do next is segue into something that we're going to do each podcast episode, and that is we're going to ask Anne to read some of these sketches or scenes or vignettes that she has written about the letters or from the letters, inspired by the letters. So we'll cut away for a moment to read through a few of those, and we're starting in the 1920s. This whole season is going to be the 1920s.
I'd also like to preface why this podcast is called Meet Me at the Wall. There was one photograph that showed my grandmother with 6 of her friends, 20 years old, on the wall at Sweetbriar College. And the photograph of these women on the wall absolutely compelled me and Betsy to identify these women, to identify descendants of these women.
Mm-hmm.
The photograph is compelling. And that's where the start of my journey began in the investigation, was being inspired by this one photograph.
And that photograph is the album art for this podcast. So you can take a quick look at that if you didn't realize what that was. It is a beautiful image.
It might be helpful to provide a little background to these sketches. Sweetbriar Girls era. 19-year-old Florence Westgate decides on a whim to attend Sweetbriar College in the fall of 1920. She forms friendships with a group of girls that last a lifetime. A photo exists of 7 of them daring to share their knees straddling on a campus wall. We have identified and researched the lives of 5 of these women and found living descendants and details of their unique stories. These sketches, or loosely formed scenes, depict some of these stories. Florence is engaged to 2 beaux simultaneously in late spring and summer of 1921. She receives word from her mother that their oil refinery business is being squeezed out by Standard Oil and the Rockefellers. Their fortunes are changing downward significantly. Thus, she enters a search for her Mrs. degree. One of the beaux, Reggie, is a cad misrepresenting his status in search of a silver spoon, and the other, Benjamin, a young investor. Each of these suitors visit Florence at Sweetbriar. The girls arrive and depart Sweetbriar via train. Florence develops a friendship with one of the porters over the years, and much of these stories are train-based, with Mr. Jeffrey, the train porter, serving as our eyes and ears. On Saturday, I went to college. At home, Titusville, Pennsylvania, August 1920. Florence finds herself at home, graduated from Miss Wright's boarding school, feeling a bit adrift. She's reclined under a fan on a hot August day, languishing with assorted fashion magazines, and comes across an advertisement for Sweetbriar College. The photographs of Virginia's rolling hills and groups of girls laughing compel her to sit straight up. Aloud, she muses for a second. Maybe I should go to college. Papa, she exclaims, and the next day is feverishly packing up her life to make the train to Lynchburg and ultimately the one to Sweetbriar. All aboard! Titusville train platform, September 1920. Florence sits with her father, Theodore Westgate, at the Titusville train station, eyes fixed on the track. So you're really doing this, going to college. Oh, Papa, stop. I know it's sudden, but it just feels so right. Sweetbriar College. Doesn't that sound simply divine? Her father starts opening the car door. Well, I hope you learned something useful there. Don't get yourself all puffed up with these newfangled fads and ideas and such. Oh, Papa, it's going to be just marvelous. Wait and see. And you and Mama can come visit me anytime. Oh, look, there's the train. Florence enters the Pullman car with luggage in tow, courtesy of the first-class porter, struggling to find enough hands to carry all her odds and ends. Theodore follows behind, and as they pause in front of the roomette, he asks the porter his name. Jeffrey, sir. It's my pleasure to meet you. Her father then slips him a folded bill with the following request. Please look after my precious girl. He turns to his daughter. Florence, meet Mr. Jeffrey. He'll look after you. Now goodbye, sweet pea. This old man needs to depart this train before I buy a ticket and join you. And with that, and a brisk hug goodbye, he departs the train as the warning whistle blows. Florence and Mr. Jeffrey are left looking at each other, surrounded by her trunks, hat boxes, and valises. Florence glances at her assorted belongings, smiles at Mr. Jeffrey, and says, I'm going to college. I'm going to attend Sweetbriar outside Lynchburg, Virginia, Mr. Jeffrey. So I'll be riding this train a lot. I hope we can be good friends. And with that, she heads on to the dining car without a backward glance. Arriving Sweetbriar, train platform in Lynchburg, Virginia, September 1920. Florence Westgate and Florence Bodine, also known as Shiny, are standing on the train platform several feet apart from each other waiting for their first train to Sweetbriar, each with their pile of belongings, Florence Westgate's being considerably larger than Shiny's. They look furtively across at each other, smile shyly, and then look away, then back. Then they laugh and move back towards each other and simultaneously say, Hi, I'm Florence. They both burst out laughing, and a lifetime friendship begins with a shared laugh, a foundation they count on throughout the decades. No matter the challenges and major bumps along the way, Shiny and Flo always find a reason to laugh. They board the train together, each secretly grateful not to be making this final part of their journey alone. They step down together on the campus platform amidst a pile of laughing, thoroughly modern girls. They have arrived. Bird Fiery, Sweetbriar platform, September 1920. Bird arrives at Sweetbriar Station ready to shake off all the accumulated trauma in her life. Being motherless early installed a graininess and fierceness that her name implies, although her eyes speak another story. The haunting tragedy that unfolded before her 5-year-old self that had already witnessed the removal of her mother's still draped body as Bird peered through her cracked bedroom door carved a hollow spot in her eyes that seemed unfillable. Its memory indelible and always lurking. The deafening sound of the surprise gunshot in the house came first. The shock of seeing blood ooze out of Asiati's temple as she sipped tea with Bird's aunt was second, followed by the finality of the thud of Azzy's body hitting the floor. The shot literally came out of nowhere. And then Bird's 12-year-old brother enters the parlor doorway, aligned with the living room entrance across the hall, a rifle in hand, looking a bit dazed. His eyes travel to Azzy on the floor. Horror sinks in, and he too caves to the ground. Bird, resolute, purposely shakes her body to dispel the perpetual melancholy she left behind in West Virginia and surveys the buzz around the platform. So many girls, so many bright smiles, so much laughter and gaiety, almost too much for her senses to absorb. But she's ready to try and waves to 2 other girls who join her as she steps off the train into her brand new life. The Train station, Erie, Pennsylvania, January 1921. Butch and Walter sit in Walter's brand new maroon Outlander, decked out in snappy white wheels and a plush corduroy interior. Butch, whose given name is Benjamin Franklin Crawford Jr., looks down the track, drumming his fingers on the outside of the door. The train is running late, and he's eager to get back to Titusville, rueful that he agreed to join Walter in his obligation to transport a family friend returning from a visit to New York. He only wanted to check out the new car. "Sorry, old chap. I'm doing this to help out Mr. Westgate. He's gone to D.C. to talk to people about the oil situation. It's not looking good." Finally, the train whistle blew from a distance and the engine chugged into sight. The young men wait in the car as a lone girl steps off the train. "I suppose we should help her with her bags." Walter opens his door. The girl has her back to them, looking the other way, and then she turns around. Florence, adorned in fur, smiles her biggest grin, walks quickly towards Walter, drops her valise, and gives him a big hug and peck on the cheek. "Oh, Walt, you are an absolute angel to rescue me. I can't believe Papa had to go to Washington again and talk about this silly old oil mess." She looks to Walter's side. "Hey, Butch. Nice to see you, too. You're sweet to come. It's been years. Absolute years, hasn't it?" Butch does not respond. He cannot respond. Cupid's arrow struck hard and fast, leaving him speechless. Walter grins, slaps Butch on the back. Don't mind his bad manners. He's just mad he's missing his winter golf day. For once in his life, golf is the furthest thing from Ben Crawford's mind. Oil-rich, standard-poor, or vice versa. Presbyterian Church, Titusville, March 1921. So how do we overcome this growing chasm? How do we, as a congregation, as a community, as a proud, unique region, move forward from these times of extraordinary boons and painful busts? Neighbor to neighbor, there exists wide gulfs of disparate situations. Can we at least practice the golden rule? We are one under God's eyes. Please, let's start acting like it. The pastor looks up from his pulpit, arms raised, eyes scanning his flock, seeing nothing but hard, empty gazes looking back at him. He sighs, lowers his arm, bows his head, and emits a quiet, "Bless these people. Thank you, Lord. Amen." Louise and Theodore Westgate sit in the Westgate pew, looking directly ahead at the empty altar. The congregation begins to stand around them. The churchgoers tentatively nod to each other before exiting their pews. The Westgates continue looking forward. Theodore begins to speak quietly out of the side of his mouth. "Please decline Emerson's invitation to Sunday supper and the Chase's military euchre night. I'm not feeling well, and I cannot bear to be in the same room as these turncoats, much less step foot inside their homes." He continues, "And it's high time we let Florence know that college is iffy for next year, and regardless, she will not be getting a new fall wardrobe. She'll have to wear last year's." Lou sits with Theodore holding his hand, head down as their dear, lifelong friends, now relegated to acquaintances, pass by. More than one gentle pat lands on her shoulder, and a grateful tear slips down her cheek. As the church empties of its last parishioners, the pastor waits at the door for the Westgates to make their exit. Theodore moves slowly. The bone setter botched his leg. His constant raw stomach pain keeps him hunched over. He approaches the open door. "I know we are late in our dues for our family pew. I'll send over a check as our business dealings settle." The pastor reaches out to his old friend and says, "Ted, as long as I'm pastor, that will remain the Westgate family pew. Go home now and get some rest." I'd better get busy. Sweetbriar dorm room, March 1921. Florence is thrilled with life at Sweetbriar, or at least everything that surrounds the academic part. The only class she excels in is her pickling class, which surprises her most of all. She's busy on campus, racing from one activity to the next. One of her favorite moments is when she receives her daily mail and retreats to her dorm room to savor whatever news the post brings. Except for this day, Florence and Shiny are in her room reading their letters. Florence opens a letter from her mother and stops, opens her mouth, puts the letter down, picks it back up again and starts to read aloud. The news she shares with Shiny is that the independent oil refinery her father owns is going bust, and her mother advises her to be prepared to wear last year's wardrobe for the upcoming fall term. I'd better get busy, Florence states, and from that point on, embarks on obtaining a Mrs. degree.
My first question after hearing those readings is, you ended with it, this Mrs. degree. I have never heard of anything like that. Can you just describe what you've learned about what that is or was?
Well, in the letters, there was a specific time where my grandmother was all of a sudden in search of suitors. We have a list of 14 of them.
14 suitors.
14 names of
Wow.
men who she dated, danced with, letters from. And so she knew that her life at Sweetbriar was probably going to change, diminish. She might not be there. And she knew that she needed to find an avenue to a life that she was used to living, which was going to not be happening anymore.
Got it. So also in the show notes, you'll see we have a photo of Florence, a beautiful photo. This is the full headshot that is just gorgeous. So you can see who Florence was, too.
Yeah, she was something.
She was. The other thing that jumped out to me is kind of in the middle of what you read, but this woman, Azzy, who was killed. So this is something that I'd like to do every episode, and that's to understand, is this truth or is this historical fiction? It's time for fact or historical fiction. So I'd like to understand, did that really happen or did you make that up?
That is a nugget of truth. And that was a very interesting time for both Betsy and me, because as we explored the names of these people and then did some research into their life, I remember very specifically when Betsy was looking up Bird's history. At one point we were on the phone and she said, I just can't take any more, because Bird's life was so tragic. So do you remember, Betsy, what that was?
Absolutely. And I also want to say it's amazing how much information is available on the internet with just a simple search. I'm not a researcher. I'm drawn to mystery. I like to investigate. And so that's been very interesting for me. But yeah, searching Bird Fiery's background on the internet came up with, this newspaper article about this shooting that happened in her home when she was a small child. And that episode alone was tragic, as Anne just read about. But there's more to come.
Bird had a tragic life.
The effect that episode had on the whole family.
Wow.
So you'll be hearing more about that in upcoming episodes.
We've just been introduced to Florence, to Shiny very, very briefly. Bird, as well as Walter. And who was Walter again? How's Walter fit in here?
Walter was the best friend of my grandfather.
Okay. Best friend. Because I want to help our listeners understand all these characters. And then Butch, otherwise known as Ben. I think we'll know him as Ben basically going forward, right?
Yes, that was my grandmother's preferred name for him.
Okay, so this was kind of the meet cute in a way. It wasn't the original necessarily, but sounded like they knew each other when they were younger, but this re-meeting.
There was a moment. And that actually, I know that my grandfather was involved in picking up my grandmother in January of 1921.
Wow.
And I think that was the moment when he was struck by Cupid's arrow.
Awesome.
Not her, though.
Yes, got it. And again, more to come.
Right.
More to come. 14 suitors. I mean, come on. You got to pick the best. There's another suitor we'll be introduced to shortly. I don't think he was in here yet. Reggie.
He was mentioned as the cad.
He was the cad at the beginning. Yeah, that's right. Great. And then it's Theodore and Louise Westgate, your grandmother's parents. One other character, though, I'm kind of curious about. I don't want to leave out here, and that's Mr. Jeffrey.
Yes, Mr. Jeffrey. He's a true nugget. My grandmother formed a friendship with him as she traveled to and from Sweetbriar and other places. That's all I'll say.
That's all you'll say now. I love this. We're going to, hopefully, listeners, we're enticing you to keep listening. We're going to have 10 episodes here for this first season of the 1920s. We're going to have a lot of fun. You're going to learn a lot of very interesting history and some beautiful details about the lives of Anne's family back then. And, that kind of brings to mind, do you think, this is 100 years ago that we're talking about, do you think in 100 years from now, someone is going to discover Anne Goodwin's texts and emails and try to come up with learning about history that way? Do you think that's possible, or are these letters something really unique?
I think that they're unique because they're ink on paper and they have lasted 100 years. Nothing we are creating is lasting today. A text is part of the cloud. Where's the cloud going? Who's going to discover the cloud? So this ability to look back in history from words written on paper is unique to now. I think we're moving from that, and I think it makes them that more of a treasure.
Betsy, a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? I think part of your life is all around artwork and what have you. So what do you think about that question of 100 years from now? Are we going to be looking at maybe artwork from now that's going to tell something? Or how are we going to know in 100 years?
I hope we're looking at artwork 100 years from now, definitely.
Yeah.
But it's going in the same direction as being digitized and
it is
in the cloud. So I really hope people will continue to put paint on canvas.
Mm-hmm.
What's really interesting is that these letters might be around 100 years from now.
True.
They might last 200 years.
Right.
So as long as we protect them, it's amazing to think that they are the ones that could go forward when our lives and the recordings of our lives may not.
So, Anne, another thought is, tell us about this oil business of the Westgates.
Yeah.
What's that all about?
The tragic oil business of the Westgates.
There you go. Okay.
As the pastor said, on one end, it was a tragedy for some, and it was a big boon for others. My grandparents came from a small town in Pennsylvania called Titusville, Pennsylvania. It was the heart of the Quaker oil region. Mm-hmm. And there were many independent oil refiners. At that time, John Rockefeller, I think he was nicknamed the Octopus Man, had so many arms out in the oil industry, and Standard Oil had a monopoly and squeezed out the independents. And my great-grandfather on my grandmother's side was one of those refiners who was squeezed out. It was devastating to the region, although the flip side, when Standard Oil was split up into 16 other entities, there was a stock split that made many other people in Titusville very wealthy people.
I see. But not the Westgates.
Not the Westgates.
Gotcha.
But the Craffords.
Oh, but the Craffords. There it is.
So what I didn't realize until we visited Titusville is that at that time, there were the independent oil producers or the Standard Oil people.
Yeah.
And so her scene in the church where they have the assigned family pews is really addressing the people who were either independent or Standard Oil and talking about the differences. I mean, imagine the effect it had on that community to be torn apart by this issue. It made the community and it also tore it apart.
Wow. And the Craffords, of course, that's Ben.
Yes.
The plot thickens.
Yes, it does.
Well, thank you so much for listening to this first episode of Meet Me at the Wall. And please join us next time. We're going to be talking more about Reggie and the juggling of these bows, as you like to say, as well as more information about Bird and her background. We've teased both of those out during this episode, so we look forward to you joining us next time. And thank you for listening. Meet Me at the Wall is hosted by Doug Martinet, Ann Goodwin, and Betsy Schmeeken. Music is written and performed by Alex Vance. This podcast is copyright 2025 by Pleasurable Pause Press. Thank you for listening, and we hope you tune in again next time.